Welcome to Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you've come to join me on a bonus episode of Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. If you've been listening, you know there are several moments where I've said, hey, I'm going to try to go a little deeper and tell you a little bit more about a subject or an aspect that might be history related only. And this is one of those days. I'm running solo, mostly because I didn't want to have to bore Matthew with just a bunch of history that he may not have much more to add to the conversation. But this also is one of the topics that I sometimes will teach my class. And the bonus episode will be on for the four founding themes. In episode 8, we looked at Jamestown and the other colonies, and we kind of worked our way through, and I noted that both capitalism and Christianity are what I consider part of our four founding themes. And I thought it might be beneficial for us to kind of walk through what I teach my students, quite honestly, in this idea of the four founding themes of the United States. So I teach at a college, as I've said before, and what I teach is mostly survey classes, so to freshmen and sophomores. In those surveys classes, what you're really trying to do with someone is you're trying to really kind of walk them through the broad aspects of the topic, whatever that might be. In my case, of course, it's obviously history. And so I personally don't think history is well expressed when the focus is on names and dates. Of course, obviously, there are certain names and certain dates at certain moments in history, depending on the topic, that it's worthwhile to get into. But in general terms, I really don't think that's helpful. And instead, what I try to always do is look at the larger picture. Like, what can we see as far as like patterns or aspects, or if we step far enough back? It's sort of the imagery sometimes I get if you go to see a painting or go to a museum, and if you walk and put your nose on the painting, you can see colors, but you have no idea what you're looking at, and you have to pull farther back. And in our case, from a history point of view, particularly in a survey class, we have the luxury of being able to spend a little bit of time where we can pull back and kind of look at the larger sweep of history as it's moving along. So when you look at the period of European exploration and colonization of the New World, there's lots of names and dates. And again, those are wonderful to get to know. And some of the big ones, 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, that kind of a thing. It can be helpful from a general sense of understanding, where we're going and what's happening. In European colonization of the New World, there's many European groups that are coming. Of course, some of you, as good listeners and good people who do pay attention to history, know Christopher Columbus was not the first European to arrive. That was our Viking ancestors, depending on where you think Leif Erikson may have come from, or others with him. Actually, I'm in the minority school who believes that there were Chinese explorers who came all the way from, obviously, China in the early 1400s before Christopher Columbus. That's a different conversation. And so you could say, well, why aren't we going to look at, the Spanish or the French, as you're just talking about these four themes from the English colonization? Well, the simple answer that I tell my students, although we do spend time in my class looking deeply at what happened with Spain and also with France, is that for the USA, our founding parent, to use that metaphor, is England. And it's because they won. They won a geopolitical struggle that was occurring in Europe in the time of, say, the 1516 and into the 1700s. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that we would be British or English, but we are. We went out and we speak English. That's one of the ways I sometimes say with my students is that, the Spanish were here first. We should all be speaking Spanish. So it raises questions as to, well, what happened? How did that go down? So, of course, if you do know your exploration period, from the coming of Columbus, a whole host of Europeans came over from that 1492 date, and they really never stopped coming. And exploration, this times in, as you may be aware, with what we call the scientific revolution and the multiple transitions and developments that are occurring, in the sciences and in technology, and it all really kind of bleeds together in one sense. And so the exploration revolution is happening at this moment, and so they're all coming, and they keep coming. And of course, as they come, the geopolitical structure of it kind of gets involved. So you have the Spanish coming, you have the Portuguese coming, you have the English coming, the French coming, the Dutch coming, the Swedish coming. They're all coming, and as they come over to the country or to the continents, they establish colonies and begin the process of bringing the European experience. And their earlier colonies, the Spanish were first in North America in 1559 in Pensacola, 1565 in St. Augustine becoming the oldest continuous city. Pensacola, they were up and down at different times. 1607, they established Santa Fe. 1607, 1608, Jamestown by the British. And the whole story begins to develop in a kind of multicultural kind of way as you kind of work your way through. And so when you look at this development and you push far enough back and you don't get too, locked into the names and details of the dates, you can say, well, there's some patterns. Like, for instance, you can say, oh, there were Swedes. Yes, in 1638, Fort Christina in Delaware, modern-day Williamsburg, modern-day Wilmington, Delaware, and then before that in 1610 on Manhattan Island, the Dutch, but we don't hear much about them. Certainly don't hear much about the Swedes. Well, what happens? Well, they lose out. They lose out to the Dutch, and then the Dutch lose out, obviously, later to the British, and Manhattan Island, it gets taken over. New Amsterdam gets taken over by forces from Britain led by the Duke of York, and it becomes New York. So you can say, what's the pattern for the Dutch or the Swedes? Well, there's not much of one. In Sweden's case, it's very under-supported from the country. Of course, this is the time for Sweden when they're fighting the 30 Years' War. So they kind of have bigger issues that they're focused on. People were not leaving Sweden to come over to this new colony. So when you look at these patterns, you can start saying, well, what's going on that we can glean from them? And so, for instance, with Spain, one of the first things that you note is that they brought their sense of a governing system over to the New World. So they governed what was called the viceroy system. But for you and me, just think of it as an extension of absolute monarchy. So there's no government of the people, which may explain why you don't have a lot of people coming. You may know, of course, they find the gold, Aztec gold, all that kind of stuff. They dealt with the Incas, and there's a really somewhat negative interaction between the Spanish and the native peoples. And then ultimately we step far enough back, we can say, okay, so the Spanish came and they kind of established cathedrals. They were really insistent in bringing Catholicism and Christianity in, perhaps we would say by force. And we could use the term that they built castles, right? But they had places for these higher nobility to come and kind of rule over the land in the feudal system that they knew of from Europe. But there's no cities. There's not really any cities to speak of in which Spanish citizens are just coming over to the New World. Go north to the French. Now, remember, the French are first arriving, roughly in 1564. They kind of get north of St. Augustine, but then more famously up in modern-day Canada, 1608 Quebec, 1643 Montreal, and they're kind of coming down from the Great Lakes region, down the Mississippi River. And so what's their pattern that we can see? Well, we see mostly trading. They went, as the other Europeans did, looking for gold. They don't really find any gold, but they do find gold in furs. They did get some support from the Catholic Church, but not at the same level as Spain. So you really don't have the sense of kind of imposed Christianity cathedrals in that kind of imagery. So you kind of get furs and forts and trading posts, but again, no real development of cities. You once again do not see French citizens coming over. Now, there was a moment when, as the Reformation is happening in France, where there really could have been, as you go through the latter 1500s, the French Protestants are struggling, and ultimately the conclusion made by the new king, Henry IV, is that Catholicism will remain the state religion. So the French Protestants could have been looking for a place to go as the future pilgrims, and we talked about in episode 8, and then others in England are looking to kind of find a way to express their own version of Christianity. And there is some of that, but they don't largely do it. And then fast forward to 1643 when Louis XIV takes over, particularly after there's a civil war about his leadership. It's known in French history as the Fronde from 1648 to 1653. After that, he basically takes absolute rule and becomes the picture-perfect model of absolutism in a European history perspective. And he basically denies the right for French Protestants to leave the country. So again, there is some development of the French into North America in the latter 1600s, and it will build a little bit into the 1700s. With Louis XIV, there begins what I call the Second 100 Years' War, as there's roughly like 100-year struggle, 120 or so years from the coming of Louis XIV. So let's think in like the 1660s, 1670s, all the way through what we call the French and Indian Wars, which ends in 1763. And then, of course, the American Revolution involves France, and then there's the French Revolution. So really, you could extend it even further out. But certainly there's like 100-year, 120-year wrestling match between France and England over who would be dominant, particularly as Spain has declined in its influence and Central Europe is still fragmented. It's not coalesced into any sort of specific larger entity or nation. So when you look at that, and particularly when you look at the New World and you kind of say, well, wow, I wonder why the French lost. One simple answer is there just weren't enough people. By 1770, there were maybe 90,000 French citizens. But in the colonies, as I've told you a couple of times, if you listen to episode 9 or 10, there were roughly 2 to 2.2 million citizens living in the 13 colonies. So just on sheer numbers alone, the British colonies in North America could dominate, the French colonists, and France was much larger of a nation than England was. Right. So anyway, with Spain, you got cathedrals, you got castles, no cities. With France, you got furs and forts, no cities. Well, that leads us to the British. So in episode 8, we talk about our first 4 colonies. So Jamestown, Plymouth, the Pilgrims, Massachusetts Bay, the Puritans. And remember, the Pilgrims and the Puritans are 2 separate, distinct groups, divisions within Christianity, but they're 2 distinct groups. And then the Catholics down at St. Mary's City. And so these 4 colonies, and then the Civil War breaks out, and there's no real colonies. And then after that, when the 2 brothers come back, James and Charles, eventually James II, Charles II, flip it around. Charles II is the monarch of the Restoration. James II is his brother who takes over at the very end before the next Civil War, the Bloodless Revolution or the Glorious Revolution. In that window of time from 1660 through the 1680s, there is this rush of new colonization of people coming that establishes the Restoration colonies. Georgia is the last colony. It actually is not until the early 1700s. So, you have the 12, then 13 colonies that have become royal colonies. They all have a name now, and there's kind of a sense of a government and an organization. And so when you look at the British colonization patterns, all this is kind of leading me up to telling you a little bit more about what I said in the episode. And we're looking for trying to understand, how can I grasp, who are these Americans? And just so you know, there's some wonderful books and research that you can read about the times when Europeans have come to the United States. Now, today in the 21st century, we kind of think, well, everybody knows everybody knows everything about everyone, and there's nobody on the planet who doesn't know a lot about the United States and hasn't seen a lot about the United States, because you think about TV and social media. I think some of that's actually probably true, that there is a sense in which people have at least a sense of a place. It may be a caricature if they're watching TV and media, whether that's whoever you're talking about. But certainly if you go way back, right? So early 20th century, 19th century, 18th century, and you were to ask somebody on the planet, even in a so-called modern or first world nation, do you know the United States? They might say yes, but if you say, what do you know about it? They'd be like, well, I don't know. I don't really know much about it at all. So people were very intrigued by this idea of this new world and of these new experiments that were happening. And they were like, well, I want to go see it. I want to know about it. And so different people came, most famously, for instance, de Tocqueville comes in the early 1800s, comes in and sees things after our revolution and actually after the French Revolution, and kind of searches things out and is eager to kind of learn more about the country, writes a book about it. But there are others who've come. And so if you were someone, you were on the outside and you were thinking, well, who are these people? What could you know about them? How could you understand them? My contention is that if you go back to our earliest colonization period and you examine these 13 colonies, there's patterns and information that come out that then you can say, oh, okay, I get who these people are. And so for my classes and for myself, the way I've taught it is that there's this pattern of these two C's and these two R's. Again, if you've listened to episode 8, you've already heard me kind of give a little bit of this. And so the two C's are capitalism and Christianity, which we see in colony number 1, Jamestown, capitalism, colony number 2, Plymouth, the Pilgrims, Christianity. And these two C's are, I think, the major forces. And then there's two R's, risk and rebellion. Now, before I go any further, I want to make sure that you understand that it's vital to realize that I am not saying to be a good American, you have to believe in these or agree with them. Or to flip it around, you don't have to believe these things. You don't have to believe that they are still good for us. I am asking you to believe that this is the pattern. But you, again, particularly with there's a move today in the early 21st century, but really since I think probably the middle 20th century, that say capitalism is bad. Look, if you think capitalism is bad, fine. You don't have to think capitalism is good. You don't have to think that rebellion is a positive force. In fact, you can say rebellion only causes trouble and we should never do that, and I would never do that. That's fine. I'm not asking you to ascribe to these four things or to say if you live in the United States now, to be an American, you must have elements of these four things. I am saying to you that to understand the country, these are the four defining features in our DNA. You know how DNA's got those letters and the scientists tell us how the different DNA pieces, and they change all the letters up as they go through the long, double helix strand of DNA. This is the United States. Capitalism, Christianity, risk, and rebellion. So let me try to walk you through it. Again, some of this you may have already gotten to. So let's start with capitalism because Jamestown is first. A simple way to understand it is keep it the phrase. I try to give a phrase for my students. So capitalism, I want to make a buck. I've come to make money. That's the whole reason that I'm coming. And this does tie into, we talked about this, I think in episode 2 or maybe 1, that I think that the idea of the American dream has been warped, and that the American dream was this concept of I was coming for liberty of expression. I was coming to the freedom to attempt whatever I may wish to attempt. And generally we're talking about like farming, but I might come and try to be a printer like Ben Franklin, and I had the freedom to try. And that's put in context against the situation that would be in Europe, in which you would not have freedom to try. You wouldn't be allowed to do this. You were pretty much limited in the structure of the feudal system as it still existed in the 1617 and even into the 1800s in some places. So here you could come, but this idea of capitalism and that I could become wealthy in it certainly is an aspect of the American dream. It's just not the dominant feature like it is today, where American dream equals I become wealthy. People weren't thinking I become wealthy. They think I become independent because I can feed myself on my own land that I have bought. And as a peasant, I could not have bought it anywhere else. I can get this land. So people are coming to make a buck, and you see this right off the bat with Virginia. It's called a joint stock company, and so think of it just like the stock market today. And the easiest way to really conceptualize it is to imagine our efforts to go to Mars. You can imagine a company like Google or Apple or maybe the car companies even, or Coca-Cola even, decides we're going to send our own rocket to Mars, and they pony up the money. And they find a company, one of the space companies that are going up there, or even with NASA, and they say, we're going to send a rocket up there. And you would imagine if they were doing it, they'd be doing it for one major reason, to make some money. They would want to somehow land. Amazon will probably be one of the first ones, so that then as other colonists come, they have a place to shop that everybody knows and loves. And Amazon will have to figure out a way to get their 2-day delivery from Earth to Mars so that it could work out. but they would be doing it to make money. And so at the time of the early colonies, that's really what's going on. Elizabeth I is the Queen of England, and the country was not very rich. So they couldn't really even think in terms of, we will publicly do this as the crown, but they said, you could sell stock. And so that's that idea. Later, after the Restoration, Charles II will kind of open up this idea of proprietary colony. So think of a proprietary colony as like you opening your own business. It basically was just, you're going to risk it. You're going to start on your own. And if you know anything about business, that happens a lot. A person will open their own business, and not until they maybe become famous later or it gets really successful will they try to sell stock. There's lots more about business, and I'm not claiming to be an expert about business, but if you understand the simple basics of how businesses work, you get what I'm talking about here. You're trying to make money. You may be trying to offer a service. You may think you have the best service or the best product that you could offer in your local community, and you're excited about the opportunity, but come on, you're doing it to make money. And that was precisely what was happening in Virginia. And then when you look at the Carolinas, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, now these were conquered places in that time of the Restoration. So I told you, New Amsterdam becomes New York, and Delaware, which is where Sweden becomes Delaware. But New York, Delaware, New Jersey, these places were all places for business, for commerce, for the marketplace. And so you can see this is very important. Christianity was number 2. So think about Christianity as this expression of religious faith, right? So for the Pilgrims, we've already talked about them. But then with the Puritans, you get the phrase that I give my students, which comes from Winthrop, which we lay out and go in depth in episode 8, when John Winthrop talks about establishing city on a hill. So this idea of city on a hill is a way to kind of remember Christianity. So capitalism, make a buck; Christianity, city on a hill. And we kind of talked our way through more in depth here, so I don't really need to spend as much time on this one. So you have the Plymouth colony with the Pilgrims, the Separatists. Then following them in Massachusetts Bay comes the Puritans. Then following them down in St. Mary's City across the water, basically from Jamestown, they set up St. Mary's City in Maryland. And then later, Pennsylvania with the Quakers, the Penn family. And then the last colony, Georgia. Georgia was known as the Holy Experiment. And it was basically a way for a Christian concept of allowing for people who were impoverished to work out their debt. Now, we may have heard, Georgia is kind of like Australia. It's where criminals were taken. Largely, the people who were brought to Georgia in this idea of this holy experiment were debtors. And this is the time when, across the world, if you owed money, and this is when we still believe debt was a bad thing. We should still think debt is a bad thing, but that's a different conversation. But clearly, if you look around, we no longer seem to think this. And who knows, maybe things have changed in a new way that I personally do not comprehend. But regardless, back in the day, if you owed money and you couldn't pay it, you'd be taken to jail. And so the idea was, let's not put these British poor people who were indebted into jail. Let's send them to the New World. And then they can work, kind of indentured servants situation, kind of give them the opportunity to own their own land. It's a longer story. But again, see Georgia as an expression of that Christian thing. Now, again, remember we said in the episode, this is not our modern version of religious freedom. It's really the freedom of Christian expression. And they're all doing their own thing. But you can see in it, as we talked about in episode 8, we're going to get to our idea of religious freedom, religious separation, because soon enough, all the colonies will begin to sort of touch base with each other, and they'll realize, hey, we're all here doing something together, kind of maybe, particularly once you get to the 1760s. Hey, we're all kind of in this thing together. But then we don't all have the same faith. And I stress yet again, I know I've made this point several times in the podcast with Matthew, this is a radical concept that you could have a civic entity that did not have a single religious functionary dominant structure. And so they were aware, hey, look, we're all kind of here. We're all kind of these colonies, but we have different viewpoints. And we saw that, for instance, in Maryland when they established religious tolerance. And then you really see it in New England when the Puritans who were coming to establish a new England couldn't hold it together. And we talked about in the episode how Roger Williams and then Ann Hutchinson, they do their own thing, and then Connecticut happens also. Okay, so capitalism, Christianity. Now, I do want to point out, if you go deeper, you'll really see these two C themes are intertwined really in all the colonies. Everybody knew they needed to make money. The Pilgrims, the Mayflower Company was a joint stock operation also. Pennsylvania was a proprietary colony, so even though it was focused on the Quakers and being a safe haven for the Quakers, like Maryland was a safe haven for the Catholics, it still was the Penn family wanted to make a little money in the process. The Christian faith was throughout all 13 colonies, and if you study deeper in the colonization period, one of the things you find out is we eventually end up in 3 larger regions with the middle colonies, so Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York, between New England and the South. And remember, Maryland and Virginia are part of the South, at least originally, and they were up through the Civil War. I know most people who live in Maryland and Virginia today may not consider themselves in the South, certainly Maryland. In any case, the middle colonies was the place where we really see pluralism really picking up. Again, the Swedes had already been there, as I mentioned. The Dutch were still there. Germans came there. My ancestors are from Western Germany, the Germanic lands, and they came over there. And so you have that also within the Christian faith. You have Quakers and Mennonites and Lutherans and the Dutch Reform and other Calvinists like Presbyterians, and so there's Anglicans and there's some Catholics, and that's where our first Jewish synagogue shows up. And so, you've got this kind of going on in there. Okay, capitalism, Christianity. The other two, we haven't really talked about these at all. So with risk, the phrase to think of is really more from the latter 19th century, but go west, young man, go west. Again, as I pointed out, people were coming for land. So they wanted to have this land, and they wanted this land that was unavailable to most peasants. My 3 ancestor brothers, they were brothers, and they were peasants. They couldn't get land in Europe, not easily, and most people couldn't. So all of a sudden, once the British have this established, by the time you're in the early 1700s, late 1600s, people all across Europe, and this will continue all the way into the 20th century. I mean, in one sense, why do people keep coming to the United States even in the 21st century? Because there's opportunity here, at least up to this point there has been, that wasn't everywhere else or in most other places. So when they come, they're coming on, obviously, our U.S. East Coast, the eastern coast of North America, and they're coming there and they immediately are pushing for frontier. Now, there's a whole longer story here about what does it mean to call something the West. And you may know of the West from some cowboy movies or the idea of the cowboys and the struggles with the Native Americans or the railroad, all the kind of, late 19th century cowboys and robbers and OK Corral and all that kind of stuff. Well, really, the concept of the frontier begins immediately in the 1600s. As soon as Jamestown is really safe and the Pilgrims are really safe by the 1630s, they're looking west. So there's always this sense of going west for land. Now, yes, as we've said, the native peoples were there, and this will raise all kinds of challenges for the native peoples as this unfolds. And there's a whole other story about what the Europeans did with the native peoples. By the way, I'll just say as an aside, it's an ancient story. The idea that we may think today that there are people living in a certain place and that place should be insoluble, that no one should come like somehow within their borders or no one should push them out. That's a very, very young, new idea. The ancient historical reality was people were constantly moving. And unfortunately, you don't like to hear it. I don't like to hear it necessarily either, but the strong survive. It's a very Darwinian type thing. And if you don't like it, you don't like Darwin, that's okay. That's your business. But it's a very accurate depiction of what happened with people coming, sometimes for trade, sometimes in fear of being moved, sometimes just for attacking, but they take stuff over. So the Europeans eventually do take over land, as you know, but they're pushing to the frontier. And so when you say the frontier at this point, we're talking about modern day Charlotte, North Carolina, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, New York, Atlanta, Georgia. That was the wild, wild West. And the West will continue to move And that allure of the West will constantly be calling for people to come, young men and women. One of the reasons the United States is so successful in its revolution, when you look at the latter 1790s into the early 19th century, is that the country was so young. By some estimates, more than 50% of the population was under the age of 16. And so what are they going to do? Well, young people are usually the most risk-taking. If you've had teenagers, you know this. They're the ones who are going to get married. They're going to have kids. They're going to go forward. They want their own land. So there's going to be this energy in the United States that's connected to this risk theme that's going to constantly be pushing. And it's going to, take the country from sea to shining sea. Again, not without impact to the original inhabitants, but it's this core aspect. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Fourth, rebellion. So here's the statement for rebellion. If I don't like it, I'll fight you. So again, capitalism, make a buck. Christianity, city on a hill. Risk, go west, young man, go west. Rebellion, if I don't like it, I'm going to fight you. And you see this right from the get-go. And particularly you see it within the Puritans. But remember we talked about in our discussion with Jamestown how Smith comes back and ultimately takes over as a little bit of a minor dictator, put a bunch of rules in place, made those nobility people get to work to save us all. He wasn't very popular, and people don't like that kind of a setting. If I can sit around and you can feed me, I'd prefer to do that. And so you can see right off the bat, there's this sense of kind of pushback. And so again, Roger Williams in 1635 taking off and eventually founding the city of Providence, and Hutchinson following along and people following her, and she founds Portsmouth. And the same time period, Thomas Hooker leaves, again, Massachusetts Bay, because in his case, he thought Massachusetts Bay was not pious enough. So 1630. So you have this period of rebellion, of kind of pushing and kind of looking for their own way to have their experience. In particular, in Jamestown in 1676, there's Bacon's Rebellion. And then 100 years, 90 years later in Pennsylvania, there's a thing called the Paxton Boys Rebellion. And that's 1760. So then fast forward not even really a decade and you get the American Revolution. So you have these moments where you can see these colonists who have come over for their independence, for their opportunity, for their way of expressing a new style of life and for freedoms, being mad if they feel those are imposed. In the movement between the Articles of Confederation and the coming of the Constitution, there was another rebellion that occurred in Massachusetts, Shays Rebellion, and when you study it, it literally is a replica of the American Revolution, except this time the power in charge were us and the people who were in charge, including at that moment the governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock. They didn't like it. That didn't stop the people. When you see people marching in the streets today for whatever reason, there's a sense in which you need to sort of applaud them and have a little bit of pride, even if you disagree deeply with why they're marching, because you can say, yep, those are good Americans right there. Now, I get it if you say to me, hang on, Carl, look, these ideas, these four things, are certainly present elsewhere in the world. And I think you might especially say that with rebellion. Lots of people have rebelled, Carl. If you study in history, there's lots of rebellions. It's like, yes, that is true. And there are places where people have taken risk to go. And I just told you about the Europeans coming over before. They're not Americans, obviously, taking this huge risk to go through the ocean and then some going overland to try to search out new things. That certainly is true. But particularly with rebellion, I want to say it this way. What the point is that the common person could be doing this. When you study all those rebellions throughout ancient history, European history, and other places, most of the time, if not all the time, they lose, and they lose big. But what was happening in North America was, in broad terms, the people who were rebelling were walking away feeling like they won. Now, they don't win all of them. If you know the Whiskey Rebellion, George Washington, during his administration, he'll send an army with Alexander Hamilton, and they will go and basically put the rebellion down, and there will be people who are arrested and put on trial. Washington will free them and, pardon them because they didn't want to be, I don't want to be guilty of somehow executing people and make people hate me. So it's not we win necessarily every time. And we could say, for instance, our African-American civil rights movement from the 1940s, starting with Jackie Robinson and the Double V campaign all the way through the 50s and 60s, could be seen as rebellions that, at least at the moment, lost. But the attitude in them is unique, in my opinion, to the United States. And that is one that says, we will win. And I will keep fighting you if I don't get my way, if I don't like it, if I don't think it's quote unquote right. And I think the same thing is true for risk. And so there is this sense in which people were pushing and going in a brave and broad way, and they weren't the rich nobility. They were the average person who just said, I'm going to go out there and see if I can cut down some trees and build a log cabin and make it happen in the process. And these four themes then combining together, in one sense, is a version of what's made us who we are. The question can be raised in current day to say, well, what happens if we lose one of them? And in particular, the risk theme has been lost. Christianity has been weakened, as we've talked about in the entire series. And I think Christianity is vital as a counterbalance to capitalism. And capitalism running amok is not helpful, but kept Christianity in its form, mostly pushing for this idea of moderation, was a counterbalance. You could say Christianity was also a counterbalance to some degree with rebellion. If we lose the balance of all four, it's potential. Now, the idea of the Western frontier closing down, that goes all the way back to the late 1890s, and historians have examined that and thought about that, and it's arguable. If you know the movie Fight Club, Tyler Durden makes a famous speech in which he talks about part of the challenge he was talking to the Gen X generation at the time. Part of the challenge is the fact that there is no great wars to fight. There's no great risk to take. I think there's some value in that, and that may be something to consider from a sense of trying to understand our own current day. But I'm not trying to do that in this bonus episode. I'm just really trying to talk you through, what is in this pattern, right? So lessons you can take away, again, kind of overview. And that is, you've got these four themes. Jamestown will kind of open this door for the pursuit of economic success. They'll, of course, figure out they've got to have community to make that happen. They need other people. They'll have those wives come. They'll start having families. The Christian expression in New England, the Pilgrims will give us the Mayflower Compact and this idea of a shared governance. The Puritans will give us this city on a hill and the beginnings of the challenges and issues with Christian expression. The Catholics in Maryland will give us our first taste of early religious liberty, establishing the Maryland Toleration Act in 1649, as we talked about in the episode. Later, Roger Williams and Hutchinson, both in Rhode Island, will create the idea of Rhode Island. We'll get a royal charter in 1663, and Williams, his idea of freedom of conscience will be kind of enshrined in that charter. And then the average person sees that they have an opportunity. Sometimes they have to come over as an indentured servant, but you put in those 7 years, and then you have a chance to go on your own. And it was a working system that allowed for average nobodies like me and my family to make their way over. They then could see that they wanted to preserve the land and preserve the rights that they believed that they had, and the ideas of shared governance would slowly spread through all the colonies. Even the proprietary colonies will eventually kind of establish a sense of governance that will kind of mimic this idea of shared governance. And so the people will kind of want to fight for it, and particularly after the Glorious Revolution, when the British Declaration of Rights in 1689, which is passed by the Parliament, that as you get these kind of increased flood of colonists who kind of make their way to the New World, they're going to bring this idea of we have these rights. We can have these rights as we go further into the frontier. So taking the risk, if we feel like our rights are being imposed upon, we can and will kind of fight for them to be protected, and we can come and make our money while at the same time expressing our faith how we wish. 2 C's, 2 R's, the way that we can understand the 4 founding themes of the United States. Hey, thanks for coming along on this bonus episode. Hope you found it helpful. As always, leave any questions you might have or email me at carl@carlkreisman.com. I'd love to hear from you if you want to talk more about this. All right, see ya.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.